The wind crawled across the wide Wyoming plain like a tired animal. The morning was colorless, a pale stretch of frost, dust, and silence. Miles Carter, a rancher who spoke less with words and more with the way he fixed fences, stood beside his old barn, watching the fog settle low. His hands were cracked, the kind of hands that told stories he never would. He lived alone, ever since the winter that took his wife and the drought that took everything else. The only thing left that still moved him was the sound of his horses breathing in the cold. That morning, when the sun had barely shown its teeth behind the hills, he noticed something out near the trough, a small shape half covered in burlap. At first, he thought it was a sack of feed someone dropped off, until it moved. He froze. His boots sank slightly into the damp soil as he stepped closer. The closer he came, the clearer the sound became, a soft, muffled sob. Like a child trying not to be heard, he knelt, lifted the edge of the burlap and found her, a girl no older than 10, trembling, her wrists raw from rope burns. Her hair was tangled with straw and dust. She didn't speak. She just stared at him, wide-eyed and still, as if bracing for another hit that never came. Miles didn't say anything either. Words didn't fit moments like this. He just looked around, the empty road, the field, the distant hills. No one. Whoever left her here didn't plan to come back. He reached out slowly, not to touch her, but to show his hands were empty. She flinched anyway. Somewhere deep inside, something old in him, something buried since his wife's last breath, cracked open. The ranch was silent again, but this time the silence carried a heartbeat. He carried her inside, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stand the sound of her shivering. The cabin door creaked open, like it hadn't been touched by kindness in years. He placed her near the fire, careful not to come too close. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him with the kind of eyes that made a man feel guilty for being alive. Her lips were cracked, her clothes thin, torn at the shoulders. Whoever left her out there hadn't cared whether she made it through the night. Miles poured water into a tin cup, set it beside her. She didn't reach for it. So he turned away, pretending not to notice, and busied himself with the kettle. But he could feel her stare, the kind that wasn't curiosity, but fear disguised as silence. It reminded him of the way his wife used to look the night the storm came, quiet, distant, already halfway gone. He told himself this wasn't his fight. There was enough pain in his own history to last a lifetime. The last time he tried to save someone, he ended up burying her on the North Ridge under a cedar tree. That was reason enough to stay out of other people's stories. Yet here was another one, dropped right on his porch, too small to even defend herself. He went outside, stood by the fence, lit a cigarette he didn't even want. The smoke curled into the dawn, thin and aimless. "Don't get involved," he whispered under his breath. "You don't owe anyone anymore." But even as he said it, he felt the lie in his chest. The sound of that child's breath inside the cabin, shallow, broken, was louder than the wind. He turned back, saw her still sitting by the fire, her small fingers clutching the edge of his old coat he had thrown beside her. Something about that, the way she held on to the warmth like it might vanish, broke the last bit of distance between them. He sighed, walked in, knelt again, and this time gently set a piece of bread in front of her. "Eat," he said quietly. "You're safe here." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened. Not trust, not yet, but the first fragile step toward it. And that was enough. Miles didn't know what came next. He just knew he couldn't let her be alone again. By noon, the storm clouds had started to gather, the kind that roll in slow, heavy, and mean. The girl hadn't said a single word since morning, just sat near the window, staring out at the dirt road that led nowhere. Miles tried to focus on his chores, but every sound outside made her flinch. When the sound of hooves echoed from the distance, she froze completely. He saw it, the panic in her eyes, sharp, instinctive, as if she recognized the rhythm of that approach. Miles stepped outside. Down the road, 3 riders appeared, their silhouettes cutting through the haze. Men like that didn't come this far out without reason. One of them dismounted, walked toward the fence, and shouted, "You seen a kid?" "Small one. Run off last night." His tone wasn't curious. It was hunting. Miles didn't answer. The man's coat was city-made, his boots too clean for the mud. Behind him, another man spat, eyes scanning the yard. "She stole something," he said. "Her daddy's looking for her." The words sounded rehearsed, too polished to be true. Miles's jaw tightened. He could feel the lie in it. He turned slightly, enough to glance through the window. The girl had backed away, hiding behind the curtain. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming one word he couldn't hear, but her eyes said everything. "Don't let them take me." He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepped closer to the fence. "Ain't seen no one," he said flatly. The man studied him for a long second, eyes cold. "If you do," he said, "you best remember who's looking." Then they rode off, dust rising like ghosts in their wake. When he went back inside, the girl was trembling. "And they said you stole," Miles muttered quietly. She shook her head hard, tears filling her eyes. Finally, in a voice small as a whisper breaking in half, she said, "I didn't steal." "He did, and blamed me." Miles didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. The bruises on her wrists told him everything. He felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Not fear, but something older, the instinct to protect what the world tries to destroy. Outside, thunder rumbled like a warning. He knew the men would be back, and when they came, it wouldn't be for questions. It would be to take her, no matter who stood in their way. He looked at her one last time that night. Her small frame wrapped in his old blanket, eyes half closed, but restless. "You'll stay inside," he said. "And whatever happens, you don't open that door." Days passed without a single visitor, but the silence between them began to soften. The girl, he learned her name was Ellie, still didn't talk much, yet her eyes had changed. The fear that once made her shrink from every sound was fading, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. Miles noticed the small things, how she folded the blanket every morning, how she placed the tin cup back exactly where he'd left it, how she stood near the door when he went outside, as if memorizing the shape of safety. One afternoon, when the sky was wide and forgiving, Miles took her out back. He handed her a small piece of wood and his old knife. "Carve the edges," he said simply. She hesitated, then copied his motion, slow, cautious. It wasn't about the carving. It was about showing her control over something again. The blade trembled in her grip, but she didn't stop. When a splinter nicked her thumb, he reached to help and she pulled away, not out of defiance, but reflex. He nodded, let her clean it herself. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned in silence. That evening, while the fire crackled, she placed the carved piece of wood on the table. It was rough and uneven, but shaped like a horse. He stared at it longer than he meant to. "You like horses?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. He smiled faintly, something he hadn't done in years. "They're stubborn," he said, "but they never forget who's kind to them." Her lips curved, the smallest ghost of a smile. Later that night, the rain began. They sat near the fire again, the same place she had first shivered in. Miles's eyes fell on the scar running across his forearm, a pale reminder of a night he wished he could erase. "I used to think I could save everyone," he murmured, half to himself. "Then I learned. Sometimes saving one person is enough." Ellie looked at him, really looked, and in her gaze, he saw something that reminded him of his wife before she died. Fragile strength, waiting to bloom again. They didn't speak after that. Words would have ruined it. She leaned her head lightly against his arm, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel haunted. It felt alive, as if two broken pieces had found the courage to fit together. It was just past midnight when the sound of horses broke the quiet again, steady, deliberate, too familiar. Miles was already awake, sitting by the dying fire, a rifle resting across his knees. The girl stirred in her sleep, a small whimper escaping her lips. He rose slowly, walked to the window. Out in the fog, lanterns flickered, 3, maybe 4 of them, moving toward the cabin. He had known this night would come. The kind of men who leave a child tied up in the cold don't disappear. They wait until someone else cares enough to fight back. He went to the girl, shook her gently awake. "Ellie," he whispered, "you remember what I said?" She nodded, eyes wide. "Stay under the floorboards. Don't make a sound." She hesitated, her hands clutching the edge of his sleeve. You'll come back? Her voice cracked like dry wood. Miles looked at her, the weight of every failure he'd ever carried sitting heavy in his chest. I will, he said, though part of him already knew that might be a lie. The first knock came like thunder. Carter, we know she's in there, a voice barked from outside. He said nothing. He just racked the rifle and opened the door halfway. 3 men stood in the rain, the same ones from before, this time with pistols drawn. The leader smirked. You got a big heart for a man who's lost everything, he said. Hand her over. She ain't yours. Miles met his gaze. No, he said simply. She's nobody's. The man's smile faltered. Then you die for her? Miles exhaled slowly. If that's what it takes. The next few seconds stretched into silence thick enough to break bones. Lightning flashed, and the first shot rang out. Miles dove behind the porch post, firing once. Clean, controlled. A lifetime of hunting turned to defense. Wood splintered. A horse screamed. One man went down, clutching his shoulder. The others retreated behind their mounts, shouting curses lost in the storm. When the gunfire stopped, Miles stumbled back inside, bleeding from a graze on his arm. Ellie crawled from her hiding place, tears streaming. You're hurt, she cried, voice trembling. He managed a weak smile. Takes more than that to stop an old fool. Then from outside, a fourth voice, unfamiliar, softer. A woman's, Miles Carter. Step away, he froze. He knew that voice from another lifetime. His late wife's sister stepped into the doorway, a deputy's badge on her chest. The girl's father has friends in town, she said. You can't win this. Miles looked at Ellie, then back at the woman. Maybe not, he said quietly. But she deserves someone who'll try. And with that, he raised his rifle again, not out of anger but love. The only kind left worth dying for. The night didn't end with victory. It ended with silence. After the last gunshot faded, the rain swallowed everything. Smoke curled from the porch rail where the bullet had split the wood. Miles leaned against the doorway, his breathing shallow, his shirt soaked in blood that wasn't all his. Outside, 2 horses had run off into the dark. One man lay still in the mud. Another groaned faintly, clutching his side. The woman, his late wife's sister, stood frozen, her badge glinting faintly in the lantern light. You could have walked away, she whispered. Miles didn't answer. He simply looked at her, eyes hollow yet steady. She lowered her gun first. You always were too stubborn, she muttered, voice cracking with something between pity and respect. Then she turned, mounted her horse, and disappeared into the rain, leaving the bodies and the ghosts behind. Inside, Ellie crawled toward him, hands trembling. You're bleeding, she said softly, pressing the hem of her torn dress against his arm. It's nothing, he murmured, but his legs gave way. He sat heavily on the floor beside the fire, the rifle slipping from his grasp. For a long moment neither spoke. Only the wind and the dying flames filled the cabin. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Miles stepped outside, a bandage across his arm, the girl trailing behind him. The world looked washed clean, the mud shining like bronze, the sky pale and wide. He dragged the fallen man's body to the hill near the fence line. No words, no prayers, just earth meeting earth. Ellie helped him, small hands patting the soil down. When it was done, she looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and something like strength. They packed what little they had, a blanket, bread, his hat, her wooden horse. Before leaving, Miles took one last look at the cabin. The smoke still lingered faintly from the chimney, curling like a memory. He knew he couldn't stay. Word would spread, men would come again. But for now, they had a few miles of freedom before the world caught up. As they rode away, Ellie sat in front of him on the saddle, her head resting against his chest. The road stretched quiet and endless ahead. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't fear anymore. It was something else entirely, something like peace. Miles glanced once at the horizon, then whispered almost to himself, "We'll keep riding, till it fits just fine." Weeks turned into months, and the dust on the trail became part of them, in their hair, their clothes, their silence. They moved from one forgotten town to another, working odd jobs, trading labor for bread, sleeping wherever the wind allowed them to rest. Miles didn't say much, but his quiet became softer, not the hard silence of grief, but the patient kind, the silence of a man learning to live again. Ellie grew stronger. Her laughter came back in small pieces, first a smile at a wildflower, then a giggle when a horse sneezed beside her. She had scars that would never fade, but she carried them lightly, like someone who had finally decided they didn't define her anymore. Sometimes, when they'd stop near a stream, she'd take out the little wooden horse she'd carved. She'd sand it with a rock until it grew smoother, smaller, as if she was shaping it into something new every day. Miles watched her from a distance, remembering the first night he found her under that burlap sack. He'd thought he was saving her, but somewhere along the road he realized she'd been saving him too. The darkness that once clung to the corners of his mind had begun to lift, replaced by a strange kind of lightness he hadn't felt since before the drought. Before the funerals, before the loneliness, one evening they reached a small valley where the grass was thick and the wind smelled clean. Miles built a fence. Ellie planted wildflowers along it, marking the start of something that wasn't haunted by the past. They never spoke of the night of the gunfire again. It didn't need words. When the sun dipped low, painting the hills in gold, Miles sat on the porch of their new cabin, watching Ellie feed the horse she'd named Hope. He smiled faintly, the lines on his face finally at rest. He picked up his hat, tilted it against the wind, and whispered the same words that had once come from fear, but now carried peace. It fits just fine. And for the first time in years, it truly did.